All right, welcome back to the channel. So Gervonta Tank Davis is exposed by Gary Russell Jr., says that Floyd Mayweather Jr. was protecting him and that you could see it because Leo Santa Cruz was beating Gervonta Tank Davis until that knockout. But also, in the conversation, some very interesting information came up in this interview about what transpired with Gary Russell Jr., Leo Santa Cruz, and Gervonta Davis that resulted in Gervonta fighting Leo Santa Cruz in his last fight. Long intro, but the video should be worth the listen, so let's do that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. So, Gary Russell Jr. is the longest reigning champion in all of boxing, having been the 126-pound WBC champion for about 6 years now. I do believe that it will be 6 years in either February or March, but in the first quarter, and probably before Gary Russell Jr.'s next fight, he will be the longest reigning champion in boxing. He has been a champion longer than most of these young guys that we're talking about have even been professional fighters. But yet, they always find a way to circumvent Gary Russell Jr., and there's a whole lot of fans, and I don't know if you're fans or not, probably just fans of another type of fighter that supports this nonsense. But Gary Russell Jr. gave an interview to Brian Custers, and it was an absolutely excellent interview. Brian Custers, in my opinion, is the best of everybody that is interviewing these fighters because he asks questions that I just didn't think he would ask. They're so pointed. They are to the heart of the conversations that are going on in the internet. He's clearly somebody that is keeping his ear out and looking for what's really going on in the boxing world. And he's just not sitting behind his, behind that gigantic camera and all that stuff and just being that guy. He's clearly into the sport of boxing. So this interview that he gave to Gary Russell Jr. was extremely fair to everybody involved, but some real good information came out of there. And the starting point for it for me was when Brian Custers asked Gary Russell Jr. who he wanted to fight next. And it went right back to, I suspect the time frame was sometime this summer, maybe June, July time frame, where Gary Russell Jr., Devin Haney, and we're going all through this back and forth, and Terence Crawford were going through this back and forth, right? And there's supposed to be a fight made that didn't happen and all of that stuff, but it took us back there. Now, the part that I'm going to talk about in this video is something that Brian Custers said to Gary Russell Jr. And what he said was, hey, I talked to Leo Santa Cruz, and Leo Santa Cruz said that he wanted to fight you. But all of a sudden, your name, Gary Russell Jr., didn't come up anymore, and he was offered the Gervonta Tank Davis fight, and that's what went down. That's why, according to Leo Santa Cruz, he ducked Gary Russell Jr. Because when he was wanting to fight Gary, out of the blue comes an offer to fight Gary Russell Jr., to fight Gervonta Tank Davis on a pay-per-view, so he takes that fight. Now, Gary Russell Jr.'s point of view response was, I never heard about that. If they were trying to make a fight with Leo Santa Cruz, nobody ever told me, right? So if that was the case, why didn't my manager call me and tell me that? Now, see, I have a theory on this. And this is what I'm saying, why I entitled the video that Gervonta Davis exposed by Gary Russell Jr. and says Mayweather is protecting Tank. Because I think that's what's going on. I sat through the entire negotiation personally, and trust me, it's not fun because that's what I would do for a living, right? And listening to people negotiate and people go through all these little detailed things, that's not necessarily fun for me, but I sat there and I listened to it, right? And it was readily apparent to me that through the process, not related to Devin Haney, because honestly, I'm so sick of Devin Haney conversation that I'm just not doing it. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm just not doing it. Every time I do a video or talk about Devin Haney and Gary Russell Jr. or something like that, just a bunch of stuff comes flying at me. So I'm just like, well, there's always a lot of stuff coming at me. But this particular stuff, I'm like, nah, it's really not worth it. There are other things in boxing that I can talk about that I think really can move the needle. One of the things that can really move the needle is for people to understand that not just non-black fighters are ducking black fighters, right? There is both in like the Canelo Alvarez type of situation where he's got all these Euro bums lined up for him to knock out. Gervonta Davis is following the Floyd Mayweather Jr. blueprint where he has a bunch of guys, a bunch of, no disrespect to the Mexican community because there's a lot of great Mexican fighters, and these are Spanish last names. So some of these guys that he's fighting are not necessarily Mexican. I do believe a couple of them are like South American. But regardless, they're slow plotting fighters that Gervonta Davis can beat. And that is what Gary Russell Jr. said. He was like, look, these guys have matchmakers. Gervonta Davis ain't somebody that worries me. I'm not worried about Gervonta Davis. He said that, look what happened with Gervonta Davis and Leo Santa Cruz. He's like, Leo Santa Cruz is a guy that started at 122 pounds. He's a good fighter at 126, but he was being very respectful of Leo. He's like, Leo's a good fighter, but Leo ain't all that. And look what happened. He's like, I think he said, I don't remember when the knockout was. It was like 6 rounds or whatever. But what Gary said was, hey, if there were 6 rounds, Leo won 4 of them. But now, see, I know what happened, right? Or at least I believe I know what happened. Once Gervonta figured that Leo Santa Cruz couldn't take his power, he just kind of started walking him down and getting him out of there. But what Gary is like saying, like, dude, but if you fight me, I'm just going to win every round because there ain't going to be no walking me down, right? Now, this is my thing. Gary Russell Jr. mentioned multiple times about matchmaking, right? Matchmaking. And matchmakers are putting guys in with guys that look good. Guys are going to look good with them. Gary Russell Jr. is a slick southpaw that can punch and is highly, highly experienced. That is not somebody that a matchmaker is going to want their guys to fight. Gervonta Davis is on the same path as Floyd Mayweather Jr. And what Gary Russell Jr. is saying is, look, dude, this dude is getting protected, right? And not only is he saying that he got protected, when what was said in that conversation, it almost seemed as if Floyd Mayweather Jr. was taking opponents from Gary Russell, right? Because that's Gary's fight. If you listen to like what Jermell Charlo said about either fighting Terence Crawford or Jermell Charlo, what Jermell Charlo said, nah, man, Canelo is Jermell's food. Terence Crawford is Errol's food, right? But clearly seeing that those are the fights that need to be made right there. Leo Santa Cruz is supposed to be the fight that Gary Russell Jr. becomes a star off of because that is his contemporary. They fought in the amateurs together. It is a very good style matchup. One is tall, one is short, one is coming forward, throwing a lot of punches. The other one's slipping punches. And if Gary Russell Jr. was able to get that fight and win it, then Gary Russell Jr. would fight 2 times a year. Now, there's another thing that was said about Gary Russell Jr. that I gotta come with. Because now, look, I'm not saying that I don't think Gervonta Davis is a very, very good fighter. I'm very supportive of Gervonta Davis, fully supportive of him. I'm not supportive of the idea that we are mind readers and know that the guys at this level of fight, that you know what the outcome is going to be. Because Gervonta Davis has never fought anything that looks like Gary Russell Jr. Do you see how a southpaw and southpaw matchup could actually happen in like how it would transpire and how awkward that could be for those guys? But Gary said, I don't need a matchmaker. I will take the fight. Now, this is the thing that gets me about Gary Russell Jr. and why I support and I make sure I do videos about Gary Russell. Because the things that are said to discredit him are ridiculous. He only fights 1 time a year. So what? So what? Tyson Fury fought 2 times in a year, and it was against Sefi Safiri and Pinata. Who cares? Another time Tyson Fury fought 2 times in a year, and it was against Otto Wallin and Tom Schwartz. Who cares? The only thing that you would do if Gary Russell Jr. fought 2 times a year and it wasn't some champion is say he's bum bashing twice as fast as you're saying he's doing it now. That's the only thing. But Gary actually had an honorable answer for that question. It said, look, the number 1 contenders are the best fighters. I fight my mandatories because I have to, but they're the best fighters. Look at Jojo Diaz. Jojo Diaz, I beat him easy. He goes up to 130 pounds. He beats Tevin Farmer easily. That was my mandatory. That's one of the mandatories they're trying to throw in the face of Gary as if that means he's not fighting anybody. Gary says King Tug. Look at King Tug. He said, man, I would love to see King Tug fight Leo Santa Cruz and see how Leo Santa Cruz did with King Tug. That is going to be a good fight, a tough fight, and it's true because King Tug is a good fighter. And if King Tug was with Top Rank, King Tug would be getting celebrated as one of the best fighters around, regardless of what they actually think about this dude's skill set. If you don't believe me, check Emmanuel Navrat at 100, who's going to be moving up to 126 pounds and is the next guy to be ducking Gary Russell Jr. Now, should Gary Russell Jr. and Tank fight? They absolutely positively should. It's a Baltimore, DC area fight. It is a huge fight. It would sell out. It would do great numbers. But the reason why that fight's not going to happen is because Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Mayweather Promotions have a long-term plan for Gary Russell Jr. For Gervonta Davis, and it does not involve losing to Gary Russell Jr. And again, it is more than an 80% chance that Gary Russell Jr. will win that fight. I would say that fight could be somewhere 55-45 Tank. 50-50 really is how I feel. Yes, Gary can get caught by Tank, but Tank has got to catch Gary. And Tank does not have a hand speed advantage. He has a weight advantage, but he doesn't really have a size and length advantage. I would love to see the fight, but it's not going to happen because Mayweather Promotions is not going to allow that to happen. And that is why we miss out in America on a lot of very, very good domestic fights that could be very entertaining and grow the sport. Because these guys have pie in the sky aspirations for these fighters, and they create a roadmap and they go on that roadmap. All reality surrounding them be danged. Dang-a-duh. Anyway, that's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think. And with that, I'm out. Peace.